The autistic son of a widowed millionaire furiously rejected anyone who tried to get close, turning their home into a silent battlefield. No nanny could last. They all ended up humiliated, bitten or spat on by the seemingly unreachable child. Until, on an unexpected late night, a young, poor cleaner accidentally enters the house and, without saying a word, achieves the impossible. Before the father's astonished eyes, the boy nestles into her arms, and for the first time kisses someone. From the window of his penthouse in Knightsbridge, London's most exclusive residential complex, Edward Blackwood watched the city he had conquered. The sky was clear that morning, but inside his 5,000-square-foot apartment, the storm had been raging for over a year. At 52, the entrepreneur had built the largest financial empire in the UK, but now he faced the one challenge for which he was unprepared: his son Michael, just 18 months old. Edward turned from the window and walked down the silent hallway to his son's room. He paused at the door, hesitant. On the other side, he could hear Michael's desperate screams and the tense voice of the nanny trying to calm him. She was the 9th nanny in 2 months. All the previous ones, even specialists in special needs, had given up. Mr. Blackwood. The nanny's voice broke through his thoughts as she opened the door. Her eyes were tired, and a fresh scratch marked her arm. "I need to speak with you." Edward knew what was coming. He had heard the same speech 8 times before. "I'm so sorry, but I can't continue. I've worked with many autistic children, but Michael—" She hesitated. "He needs someone with experience far beyond mine, someone who can break through that barrier." Edward nodded, resigned. He paid her double the agreed-upon amount and watched as the nanny quickly gathered her things, as if she feared changing her mind if she stayed a minute longer. When the elevator doors closed, Edward returned to his son's room. Michael was curled up in a corner of the crib, rocking back and forth, his eyes fixed on the wall. Edward approached slowly. "Hey, champ," he whispered, extending a hand. Michael didn't react, as if his father were invisible. Edward tried to touch his shoulder, but the boy immediately started screaming, thrashing violently. Edward retreated, defeated. One of the most powerful men in Britain, and he couldn't even touch his own son. Since Helen was gone a year ago, when a postpartum complication took her away forever, Michael had completely shut down. The autism diagnosis came a few months later, but the doctors had said Michael's condition was particularly severe, aggravated by the trauma of losing his mother. Edward went down to his study and called Dr. Evans, the pediatric neurologist who was treating Michael. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand your frustration," she said after hearing about the 9th nanny's resignation, "but we need to be patient. Children with severe autism like Michael need consistency, a stable routine." "How can I provide consistency if no one can stay for more than 2 weeks?" Edward ran a hand through his graying hair. "I've tried everything, doctor. The best professionals in the country, experimental therapies, imported sensory equipment." "Money can't solve everything, Mr. Blackwood," the doctor interrupted gently. "What Michael needs is someone who can establish a genuine connection with him, someone who understands his unique language." "And where am I supposed to find that person?" Edward asked, knowing there would be no answer. After hanging up, Edward went to the bar and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He had promised Helen in her final moments that he would care for Michael with all the love in the world. Now he felt he was failing miserably at that promise. Meanwhile, miles away in the neighbourhood of Barking, on the eastern outskirts of London, Julia Miller was finishing preparing dinner for her mother. Nora was sitting in the small living room of their 2-room flat, wrapped in blankets despite the warm evening. "This soup will be good, Mum," Julia said, trying to sound cheerful as she helped her mother sit up more comfortably. "I put in those herbs the doctor recommended." Nora smiled faintly. At 60, she was battling a rare and degenerative disease that was draining her savings and her strength. Ever since Nora's husband abandoned them when Julia was just 5, mother and daughter had faced every hardship together. "You don't have to do this, darling," Nora said in a weak voice. "You already work so hard. You should be studying, dating, living your life." Julia, at 23, worked as a cleaner in one of London's most luxurious buildings, always on the night shift. Her salary barely covered the rent and her mother's medication, but hope had emerged when they discovered an experimental treatment that could significantly improve Nora's quality of life. "My life is taking care of you, Mum," and soon I'll be able to afford that new treatment. Dr. Morris said the results are very promising. Julia didn't tell her she had taken on extra hours and double shifts to save the money. She preferred the night shift, when the residents were asleep. She could do her work in peace without feeling watched or judged, invisible as she had always felt in life. After dinner, Julia helped her mother take her medicine and put her to bed. She grabbed her uniform, packed a container with her meal, and left to catch the bus that would take her to the other end of the city, where the mirrored skyscrapers contrasted with the reality of the outskirts. She arrived at the luxurious Kensington Gardens complex around 11 at night. The security guard already knew her and just nodded as she passed, showing her ID badge. In the staff room, she found Sharon, her supervisor, waiting with a worried expression. "Julia, we have an emergency," Sharon said, handing her a piece of paper. "Apartment 2001, the penthouse. A pipe burst in the kitchen, and water is leaking all over the apartment. The resident is Mr. Edward Blackwood." Julia's heart sped up. Everyone knew Edward Blackwood, the billionaire founder of the Blackwood Group, one of the richest and most powerful men in Britain. "But I've never worked in the penthouses," Julia protested. "Shouldn't it be Denise? She has more experience." "Denise is on medical leave and you're the only one available right now. We're paying double overtime." Sharon hesitated. "Julia, I know you need the money for your mother's treatment. This is a good opportunity." Julia had no choice. She took the service elevator to the penthouse, carrying her cart with cleaning supplies. When she reached the floor, she was momentarily breathless at the sheer scale of the apartment. The entryway was larger than her entire flat. Following instructions, she went to the kitchen, where she found the situation. Water was dripping from the ceiling, forming a considerable puddle on the Italian marble floor. She immediately got to work, using buckets to contain the leak while waiting for the plumber. She worked in absolute silence, aware that there was a child sleeping in the apartment. Julia had always been like that, discreet, efficient, invisible. She had learned early on that people like her, from a humble background, with dark skin and an incomplete education, were only noticed when they made mistakes. After containing the initial leak, she began to dry the floor when she heard voices coming from one of the hallways. Moving silently, she saw a slightly ajar door from which a faint light emanated. She didn't want to pry, but she needed to announce her presence so as not to startle anyone. She approached slowly, and that's when she heard a woman's voice on the phone. "Mum, you have no idea what hell it is to work here. This kid is impossible. He bites, scratches, screams all day. Not even the specialist can handle him. I'm quitting tomorrow. I can't take it anymore. I'm only putting up with it for the money, which is absurd." Julia realized it was the nanny, and she was talking about the owner's son. She felt a pang of indignation at the contempt in the woman's voice. She was about to turn away when she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. In the dimness of the room, behind the nanny who was speaking with her back to the crib, a small boy was standing, holding onto the bars, looking directly at Julia through the crack in the door. His large, dark eyes seemed to see right through her, in a way Julia had never experienced before. For a few seconds, they stayed like that, Julia motionless in the hallway, the boy observing her in silence. There were no screams, no crying, just a deep, curious gaze. The nanny continued on the phone, completely oblivious to the fact that the child had woken up. "I'll get my letter of recommendation and find a normal family next time. An autistic child isn't for everyone, especially a lost cause like this one." That's when something happened that would change Julia's life forever. The boy, still looking at her, lifted his small hand and in a gentle gesture waved. A movement so simple, yet judging by the nanny's surprised look when she finally turned and saw the boy awake, it seemed extraordinary. "Michael!" the nanny called, incredulous, approaching the crib. Immediately the boy started screaming and thrashing, backing into the corner of the crib, as if the mere sound of her voice hurt him. Julia didn't think twice. She entered the room silently. "Excuse me," she said in a low voice. "I'm here to deal with the problem in the kitchen. Sorry to disturb you." The nanny turned, surprised and embarrassed, realizing someone might have overheard her phone conversation. "Who authorized you to come in here?" she asked defensively, but Julia didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the boy who had stopped screaming the moment she spoke. Michael watched her with intensity, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Slowly, without any sudden movements, Julia approached the crib. She spoke in a soft voice, almost a whisper. "Hi, little one. It's okay. I just came to help with the water in the kitchen. You don't need to be afraid." To the nanny's shock, Michael didn't back away. On the contrary, he moved slowly toward Julia, still holding onto the crib bars. When he was close enough, he did something that left the nanny speechless. He stretched his small arms out toward Julia, in a clear request to be picked up. "He's never done that," the nanny murmured, perplexed. "Never, with anyone." Julia hesitated, looking to the nanny for permission. The woman, still in shock, just nodded. With extreme gentleness, Julia reached out and picked Michael up. She expected him to resist, to start screaming as he had with the nanny. But instead, the boy snuggled against her chest, resting his head on her shoulder, as if he had finally found a safe harbor after a long storm. It was at that exact moment that the bedroom door opened completely, revealing the imposing figure of Edward Blackwood, who stopped, frozen, before the impossible scene unfolding before his eyes. Edward Blackwood remained frozen in the doorway, unable to believe what his eyes were witnessing. His son, Michael, who for months had rejected all human contact, was comfortably nestled in the arms of a stranger, with an expression of peace Edward hadn't seen since the days when Helen was still alive. "What is going on in here?" he finally asked, his voice wavering between surprise and confusion. The nanny, visibly flustered, began to explain. "Mr. Blackwood, This young woman came in and—" But Edward was barely listening. His eyes were fixed on Michael, who, contrary to his usual behavior, showed no signs of distress. Instead, the boy's eyes were half closed, almost drowsy, completely relaxed against the body of the young woman holding him. "Who are you?" Edward asked Julia directly, approaching cautiously so as not to disturb the fragile moment. "Julia Miller, sir." "I'm on the cleaning crew," she answered in a low voice, conscious of the child's weight in her arms and the intensity of the man's gaze. "There was a leak in the kitchen and I came to fix it. I'm sorry for entering without notice." Edward watched the scene for a few more seconds, as if trying to process the statistical improbability of what was happening. Then slowly he extended his arms toward his son. May I take him?" There was a vulnerability in his voice that starkly contrasted with the powerful figure who regularly graced the covers of business magazines. Here was just a father, desperate to connect with his son. Julia nodded and, with extreme care, began to transfer Michael into his father's arms. But as soon as the boy realized what was happening, his body tensed. He started to squirm, on the verge of one of his meltdowns. Seeing this, Julia quickly pulled back. "Wait," she said softly. "I don't think he's ready yet." To Edward's surprise, she then did something unexpected. Instead of simply handing Michael back, Julia moved closer, standing side by side with Edward, and began to hum a soft, almost inaudible melody. It was a lullaby Nora used to sing to her as a child. Michael, who had been about to have a meltdown, calmed at the sound of the melody. His eyes went from Julia to his father, as if making a connection that had been impossible until now. "Talk to him," Julia encouraged Edward in a whisper, very quietly, like it's a secret. Edward, though initially hesitant, leaned in slightly. "Hi, Michael," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's Daddy." What happened next left the three adults in the room speechless. Michael, still in Julia's arms, reached out one of his small hands and touched his father's face. It wasn't an accidental touch, but a deliberate, conscious one. And then, as if that contact had opened a long-sealed floodgate, the boy did something Edward would never forget. He smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile, but undeniably real. The first since Helen was gone. The emotion was too much for Edward. Silent tears began to stream down his face as he remained perfectly still, fearing that any movement might shatter the precious moment. Julia felt a lump in her throat. There was something so profoundly intimate about the scene that she felt like an intruder. "I think I should get back to the kitchen," she said quietly, trying to find a way to transfer Michael without causing another crisis. But when she tried to move away, Michael clung to her, refusing to let go. At the same time, he maintained contact with his father, as if for the first time he was willing to allow two people into his world simultaneously. It was the nanny who broke the silence, her voice filled with astonishment. "In 9 weeks working here, "I've never seen anything like it," she admitted. He's never responded like this to anyone." Edward quickly wiped his tears with his sleeve and regained his composure. "Mrs. Davies," he addressed the nanny, "could you give us a few minutes?" The woman nodded and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. When they were alone, Edward gestured to the armchair in the corner of the room. "Would you mind sitting down? I think we can stay here a little longer." Julia nodded and sat in the armchair with Michael still in her arms. Edward pulled up a small stool and sat opposite them, close enough to maintain eye contact with his son, but not so close as to startle him. For several minutes, they sat in silence, just watching as Michael, seemingly exhausted by all the interaction, began to fall asleep in Julia's arms. His small body, once always tense and defensive, was now completely relaxed. "How did you do that?" Edward finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. Julia shook her head slightly. "I didn't do anything, sir. He chose me somehow." "Do you have experience with autistic children?" "No, sir. In fact, I've never worked with children. I'm just a cleaner." Edward studied her intently. There was something in the way she held Michael, in the calm she radiated, that seemed almost therapeutic. "How much do you make a month?" he asked abruptly. The question caught Julia by surprise. "I'm sorry?" "Your salary. How much does the cleaning company pay you?" 1.5 times the minimum wage, sir. With the night shift extras, it's almost 2. Edward did a quick mental calculation. "I'll pay you 3 times that to take care of my son." Julia stared at him, stunned. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not a nanny. I'm not qualified for this. Michael needs specialized professionals, people who understand autism." 9 specialized professionals have passed through this house in the last 2 months, Edward replied, gesturing to his sleeping son. "None of them achieved what you did in 10 minutes. Julia hesitated. The offer was tempting. The salary would be more than enough to pay for her mother's experimental treatment. But the responsibility felt overwhelming. "Can I think about it?" Edward nodded, though it was clear he wasn't used to hearing maybe as an answer. "Tomorrow, then?" "I need you to come back tomorrow, regardless of your decision. Michael needs a smooth transition." He paused, looking at his son. "Besides the salary, I can offer something more." Julia waited, unsure of what was coming next. "I noticed you mentioned a treatment for your mother when you were talking to the nanny in the hallway," Edward continued. "I can arrange the best treatment for her at the private hospital I own. At no cost." Julia's eyes widened. This was more than she could have ever dared to dream. "How did you—" "The walls have ears, Miss Miller," Edward replied with a faint smile. "Especially when there's an intercom system for the baby's room." Julia felt her face burn with embarrassment, realizing he had probably also heard the nanny's comments about Michael. "I'm not trying to buy you," Edward added, seeming to read her thoughts. "I'm offering a fair exchange. You help my son, I help your mother. It's as simple as that." Nothing about the situation seemed simple to Julia, but the prospect of giving Nora the treatment she so desperately needed was irresistible. "I need to talk to my mother first," she said finally. "But I will be back tomorrow, as you asked." Edward nodded, satisfied. Then, with extreme care, he stood up and extended his arms. "I'm going to put him in his crib now." This time, when Julia transferred Michael into his father's arms, the boy didn't resist. He continued to sleep soundly, as if for the first time in a long time he felt truly safe. Edward placed his son in the crib with a gentleness surprising for a businessman accustomed to commanding empires. He watched his son for a moment, the peaceful expression on the little face that usually only showed anguish. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said quietly, still looking at Michael. "This is the first time in almost a year I've been able to touch him without him having a meltdown." Julia didn't know what to say. She was still trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour, how her life had completely changed because of a burst pipe. When they left the room, they found the nanny in the hallway, visibly nervous. "Mr. Blackwood, about what you heard. I'd like to explain—" Edward held up a hand, cutting her off. "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Davies. I understand that caring for Michael is challenging, but we don't need to discuss this further. Miss Miller will be taking over your duties as of tomorrow." The nanny looked from Edward to Julia, a mixture of indignation and disbelief on her face. "You're replacing me with a cleaner?" The contempt in her voice made Julia shrink involuntarily, a conditioned reflex from years of subtle and not-so-subtle humiliations. Edward, however, was unfazed. "I'm replacing you with someone my son has connected with," he replied firmly. "Your severance will be deposited tomorrow, along with a letter of recommendation. I'm sure you'll find a more suitable position soon." Without giving her a chance for further protest, Edward led Julia to the living room. The plumber had arrived and was finishing the repair in the kitchen. "Don't worry about that now," Edward told Julia, noticing her glance toward the kitchen. "You've already done the most important job tonight." Taking out his phone, he made a quick call. "Anthony, I need you to take Miss Miller home now." "Yes, my personal driver." Covering the phone, he asked, Where do you live?" "Barking," Julia replied, feeling increasingly out of place in this world of luxury and convenience. Edward nodded and completed the instructions to the driver. "Oh, hand send a medical team to her address tomorrow morning. I want a full evaluation of her mother, and I want her transferred to St. Luke's Hospital immediately." Hanging up, Edward turned back to Julia, who was looking at him in astonishment. "Tomorrow at 10, my driver will pick you up. Is that all right with you?" Julia nodded, still dazed. "Mr. Blackwood, this is all... It's too much. I don't even know if I can really help Michael. What happened tonight might have just been a fluke." Edward smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen on his face. "Miss Miller, I built my fortune by recognizing opportunities that others mistook for flukes. What happened tonight was not a coincidence. My son saw something in you that he hasn't seen in anyone else since he lost his mother." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "I can't explain it, but I feel you are exactly what he needs right now." Before Julia could respond, the doorbell rang. It was Anthony, the driver, ready to take her home. "Until tomorrow, Miss Miller," Edward said, extending his hand for a formal shake that felt strangely inadequate after the intimacy they had shared in Michael's room. Julia shook his hand, feeling the contrast between the businessman's soft skin and her own hands, calloused from years of work. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Blackwood." During the entire drive to Barking, Julia remained silent, watching out the window of the luxurious black sedan as the city passed by, from the opulence of Kensington to the stark reality of the outskirts. It was as if she were traveling between two different worlds, two realities that should never have intersected. And yet, they had intersected that night. Because of a burst pipe, an autistic child, and a look that seemed to see beyond appearances. When the car stopped in front of her modest building, Julia hesitated before getting out. "Are you really coming back tomorrow? With the doctors?" she asked the driver, still unable to believe the turn her life had taken. Anthony smiled in the rearview mirror. "If Mr. Blackwood said we're coming back, miss, we'll be back. He's a man of his word." Julia nodded and got out of the car, feeling the weight of her neighbor's curious stares, who had never seen such a luxurious car on their street. She climbed the stairs to the small flat, where Nora was already asleep. Sitting on the edge of her mother's bed, Julia looked at the face aged prematurely by illness and a hard life. How would she explain to her that suddenly one of the country's richest men was offering comprehensive treatment and a salary 3 times her current one? And how would she explain to herself the inexplicable connection she had felt with that child, that small being who had somehow chosen her from within his silence? Lying down on her mattress on the living room floor, Julia stared at the peeling ceiling, so different from the immaculate marble of the penthouse she had just left. She closed her eyes, and the last image that came to mind before she fell asleep was of Michael smiling at his father while touching his face. Something profound had changed that night. She could feel it, as if the universe had subtly altered its course. What would come next, however, was beyond anything Julia could have imagined. The next morning dawned with a different kind of light for Julia. When she opened her eyes, for a moment she thought it had all been an elaborate dream, the luxurious apartment, the autistic child who had inexplicably accepted her, the billionaire offering to change her life. But Edward Blackwood's business card on the coffee table confirmed it had all been real. She got up quickly, worried about how to explain everything to her mother. Nora had always been wary of sudden favors, a reflex from a life where nothing had come easy. "Good morning, darling." Nora's weak voice came from the bedroom. She was already awake, sitting up in bed with difficulty. trying to reach her medicine on the nightstand. Julia rushed to help her. "Mum, I need to tell you something important," she began, as she helped Nora take her medication. "Last night, something unbelievable happened." Bit by bit, Julia recounted the events of the previous night. As the story unfolded, Nora's eyes widened in a mixture of astonishment and suspicion. "Julia, this doesn't make any sense," she interrupted, when Julia mentioned Edward's offer. "Why would such a powerful man entrust his son to a stranger with no qualifications? And this business of paying for our treatment. Something's not right." Julia was about to respond when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw a man in an impeccable suit, the same driver from the night before, accompanied by two people in white coats. "It's them." "Mum," she whispered, her heart racing. She opened the door, conscious of the contrast between her simple flat and the elegant visitors. "Good morning, Miss Miller," Anthony greeted with professional formality. "These are Dr. Marina Campos and Dr. Ricardo Mendez from the medical team at St. Luke's Hospital." The doctors entered politely, and Julia noticed how they avoided showing any reaction to the modest surroundings. They were introduced directly to Nora, who watched them with poorly concealed suspicion. "Mrs. Miller, we're here at Mr. Blackwood's request for an initial assessment," Dr. Marina explained in a gentle voice. "May we talk a little about your medical history?" While the doctors examined her mother, Julia went to the kitchen to make coffee, embarrassed that she had nothing better to offer. Anthony followed her. Mr. Blackwood asked me to give you this," he said, handing her an envelope. Inside was a preliminary employment contract and a cash advance equivalent to a month of her current salary. "He also asked me to inform you that an apartment has been prepared for you and your mother in the annex of the main residence to facilitate your work with young Michael." Julia felt her head spin. "An apartment? But this is too much. I can't accept." Anthony smiled understandingly. "Mr. Blackwood mentioned you might say that. He asked me to remind you that it's not charity, it's an exchange. You take care of his son, he provides the proper conditions for you to do so." Before Julia could reply, Dr. Marina appeared at the kitchen door. "Julia, your mother needs to be admitted, so we can start the treatment immediately." "We've already arranged for an ambulance." "Admitted?" "But it's just to stabilize her and begin the protocol. The experimental treatment she needs requires constant monitoring at first. Everything happened very quickly after that. In less than an hour, Nora was being transported in a luxury ambulance, while Julia hastily gathered a few essential belongings. "Don't worry about the rest," Anthony instructed her. "Mr. Blackwood will send a team to pack and transport everything to the new apartment." On the way to the hospital, Julia watched her mother, who seemed simultaneously frightened and impressed by the speed of events. "This isn't right." "Julia," Nora whispered when the doctors moved away for a moment. "No one does this kind of thing without expecting something in return." "He is expecting something in return. Mum, he wants me to take care of his son." "You know what I mean," Nora insisted, her eyes worried. "Rich men like him. They see women like us in a certain way." Julia felt her face flush. "It's not like that, Mum. It's about Michael." "You should have seen it. It was like he recognized me, like..." "Like what?" Julia hesitated, unsure how to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "Like he knew who I was." St. Luke's Hospital was the most luxurious in London, frequented by the British elite. Nora was settled into a private room that looked more like a five-star hotel suite. The medical team was already briefed on her history and immediately began preparing for the experimental treatment. "Your mother is in good hands," Dr. Ricardo assured her. "Mr. Blackwood has given instructions for her to receive the best possible care." "How long will she be admitted?" Julia asked, still trying to process the speed of the changes. "Initially 2 weeks. Then we'll evaluate her response to the treatment." Julia stayed with her mother until she fell asleep, sedated for the first round of tests. When she left the room, she found Anthony waiting patiently in the hallway. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting," he informed her. "Michael has had a difficult morning." On the drive to the Blackwood residence, Julia tried to organize her thoughts. In less than 24 hours, her life had been turned completely upside down. Part of her was deeply grateful for the opportunity to give her mother the treatment that could save her. Another part, however, felt unsettlingly indebted. obligated to live up to the expectations of a man who had the power to change lives with a single phone call. What if she failed with Michael? What if the connection from the night before had just been a fluke, a one-time event? The Blackwood residence, seen in the daylight, was even more impressive. Located in one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods, it was a monument to wealth and power. Glass, steel and concrete combined in sleek modern lines, surrounded by a meticulously manicured garden. Anthony led her not to the main entrance, but to an annex building, connected to the main house by a glass-covered walkway. "This is your new flat," he explained, opening the door to a space that made Julia stop, speechless. The apartment was more than 3 times the size of her old home, decorated with understated elegance and equipped with everything one could possibly need. Large windows offered views of the gardens, and the kitchen looked like something out of a television show. "Your belongings will arrive later today," Anthony informed her, handing her a set of keys. "And here is a new mobile phone. All the necessary contacts are already programmed." Julia accepted the device, feeling more and more like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. "Now if you'll follow me." Mr. Blackwood is waiting. The main house was a study in controlled opulence. Everything was of the highest quality, but without vulgar ostentation. Contemporary British art shared space with carefully selected antiques. Edward Blackwood awaited them in a spacious office. He looked as if he hadn't slept. His face had dark circles under the eyes, but there was a nervous energy in his movements. "Miss Miller, thank you for coming," he said, dismissing Anthony with a gesture. "Michael had a rough night. Since you left, he's been difficult." As if to confirm his words, a child's cry echoed from somewhere in the house. "The night nanny is with him now." "But—" Edward ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "He hasn't stopped crying since he woke up." Julia felt a tightness in her chest upon hearing the anguished cry. "May I see him?" Edward nodded, looking relieved that she hadn't backed down. He led her through elegant corridors to Michael's room, from where the cries were intensifying. Upon entering, they found a scene of contained chaos. The nanny, a different one from the night before, was trying to soothe Michael, who was writhing in his crib, his face red from crying, refusing any contact. "This is Mrs. Gable, our night nanny," Edward introduced quickly. The woman looked exhausted and at the end of her rope. "He's been like this since 5 in the morning," she reported, not hiding her relief at seeing Julia. "He won't take food, won't let anyone touch him." Julia approached the crib slowly. Michael continued to cry, seemingly oblivious to her presence. But when she spoke, her voice low and melodic, something shifted. "Hi, little one," she said softly. "Remember me?" Michael's crying subsided slightly, though he remained agitated. His eyes, filled with tears, met Julia's, and there was a moment of recognition. "It's okay," she continued in the same calm tone. "I'm here now." Slowly, she reached her hands into the crib, not trying to touch him, just letting him see her movements. To the nanny's astonishment and Edward's visible relief, Michael gradually calmed down. "May I?" Julia asked Edward, indicating she wanted to pick the boy up. He nodded, watching intently. With gentle movements, Julia picked up Michael, who, though still sobbing, did not resist. On the contrary, he clung to her shirt as if afraid she might disappear again. I know," she murmured against the boy's hair. "I missed you too." The naturalness with which she said it surprised Julia herself. It was true. During the night she had thought of the child several times, wondering how he was. Michael relaxed in her arms, his crying stopping completely. He rested his head on her shoulder and sighed deeply, as if he could finally rest. "Incredible," Mrs. Gable murmured. "Simply incredible." Edward seemed too emotional to speak. He gestured for the nanny to leave them, and when they were alone, he approached cautiously. "He needs to eat," he said quietly. "He hasn't accepted anything since last night." Julia nodded, rocking Michael gently as she thought. "Is there a high chair?" The chair was in the corner of the room. Julia sat down with Michael on her lap, not trying to put him in the chair just yet. "Where's the kitchen?" she asked. Edward led her to an impressive professional kitchen, where a team of staff worked silently. Upon seeing their boss enter with Julia and Michael, everyone stopped their activities. "What does Michael usually eat?" Julia asked. "Lately, almost nothing," Edward answered with concern. The nutritionist recommended these liquid supplements to ensure he gets the necessary nutrients. Julia looked at the boy in her arms, who was observing everything with curious eyes, a stark contrast to the distressed child from minutes before. "May I try something different?" Edward made a broad gesture. "The kitchen is at your disposal." Julia asked for fruit, oatmeal, and plain yogurt. While the chef prepared the ingredients, she continued to hold Michael, who seemed fascinated by the kitchen's activity. "He likes to watch," she commented, noticing how the boy's eyes followed the chef's actions. "We can use that." When the ingredients were ready, Julia sat with Michael at the kitchen table, still not trying to transfer him to the high chair. Instead, she took a piece of banana and began to eat it herself, making small sounds of appreciation. Michael watched her intently. After a moment, Julia offered him a small piece of the fruit. The boy hesitated, but to the surprise of Edward, who was watching everything in respectful silence, he eventually accepted it. "That's it." "Very good," Julia encouraged him gently. Step by step, with infinite patience, she managed to get Michael to eat a good portion of the prepared meal. She didn't try to rush or force him, she simply followed his pace, attentive to the cues he gave. "How did you learn to do that?" Edward asked, genuinely impressed. Julia smiled shyly. "My mother used to say I was like this as a child. Extremely sensitive to noises, textures. She had to have a lot of patience to feed me." Something shifted in Edward's gaze, a sudden understanding. "I was never officially diagnosed," Julia clarified. "We didn't have the resources for that. But yes, I was probably on the spectrum. I'm still sensitive to many things. Loud noises, crowds, certain fabric textures." She paused, looking at Michael. "I think that's why he feels safe with me. Maybe he recognizes something familiar." Edward watched her with new respect. "Why didn't you tell me this yesterday?" "I didn't think it was relevant," Julia answered honestly. "And I didn't want you to think I was trying to qualify for the job based on it." "But that's exactly what qualifies you," Edward insisted. "More than any degree ever could." After the meal, Julia managed to take Michael back to his room without any resistance. The boy seemed content just to be with her, watching her every move with attentive eyes. While organizing some things in the room, Julia hummed quietly, the same soft melody from the night before. Michael, sitting on the rug near her, seemed relaxed in a way that, according to Edward, was completely new. "He's never this calm," he commented from the doorway where he was watching them. "He's usually always agitated, anxious." Julia smiled at the boy, who was playing peacefully with some colored blocks, something that, Edward explained, he rarely did before. "He feels he can trust me," she replied simply. "For children like Michael, trust is everything." The rest of the day passed in a quiet routine that formed naturally. Julia discovered that Michael responded well to predictability, but without excessive rigidity. She allowed him to set the boundaries of contact, never forcing interactions, always respecting his signals. Edward watched everything with a mixture of amazement and relief, occasionally joining them when Michael seemed receptive. There were delicate moments of connection between father and son, brief, still tentative but real. Late in the afternoon, while Michael was napping, Edward invited Julia for a conversation in his office. "I've seen enough," he said as soon as they sat down. "I want to make our partnership official, not just as a nanny, but as Michael's primary therapist." Julia looked at him surprised. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't have the training for that. I can help with daily care, but therapy—" "You've been doing therapy since you arrived," Edward interrupted gently. "Every interaction, every moment. I've seen more progress today than in months of conventional therapies." He pushed a folder across the desk. "This is the formal contract. Salary as we discussed, plus quarterly bonuses based on Michael's progress. The apartment is yours for as long as you work with us. And your mother's treatment is guaranteed regardless of how long you stay." Julia opened the folder, stunned by the figures mentioned. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of earning. "Are you sure about this? What if it doesn't work out in the long run?" Edward studied her for a moment. "Miss Miller, Julia, I've hired the best specialists in the world. I've spent millions on therapies, equipment, medications. Nothing worked." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "Today I saw my son eat voluntarily, play with concentration, even smile. Things that haven't happened since—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Since your wife passed away," Julia finished softly. Edward nodded, regaining his composure. "Helen was extraordinary. Michael adored her. When we lost her, it was as if a part of him went with her." Julia felt a lump in her throat. There was so much pain in this man, carefully contained behind a facade of control and power. "I'm not trying to replace his mother," she said carefully. "I know," Edward replied. "But you're giving him something he lost. Security, understanding." He looked her directly in the eye. "So do you accept?" Julia thought of her mother, of the treatment that could save her. She thought of Michael and the inexplicable connection they had formed. And she thought of herself, the sensitive girl from Barking who had always felt out of place in the world, and who now, somehow, had found a place where her difference was precisely what made her valuable. "I accept," she replied, signing the contract. Edward smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his tired face. "Welcome to the Blackwood family, Julia." As she shook her new employer's hand, Julia couldn't imagine how those words would eventually become far more literal than either of them could have predicted at that moment. The following weeks brought a transformation that not even the optimistic Edward Blackwood had dared to expect. Michael, who had once lived in an isolated world of constant meltdowns, began to blossom under Julia's care. Each small step forward was celebrated as a significant victory. The first dada babbled during breakfast, the first spontaneous hug for Edward, the first full night of sleep without nightmares. Julia had created a routine that respected Michael's sensory needs, while gradually expanding his boundaries. Mornings began with soft music and sensory integration exercises. She had researched in the extensive medical libraries available at the residence. Afternoons included walks in the garden, where Michael could explore different textures, sounds, and smells at his own pace. Edward, initially an anxious observer, became more involved each day. Julia taught him with infinite patience how to interpret Michael's subtle cues, how to offer presence without pressure, how to turn everyday tasks into moments of connection. "You have a natural gift for this," Edward commented one afternoon, as they watched Michael play with water in a small garden fountain. The boy was completely absorbed, fascinated by the movement and sound of the water running through his fingers. "It's not a gift," Julia replied with a smile. "It's lived experience. I know what it's like to feel overwhelmed by a world that's too loud, too bright, too fast." There was a moment of comfortable silence between them, the kind that only happens when two people begin to understand each other without words. "How is your mother?" Edward finally asked. Julia's smile widened. "She's responding incredibly well to the treatment. The doctors are impressed. They say in a few weeks she might be discharged to continue treatment as an outpatient." "That's wonderful," Edward replied, genuinely pleased. "The apartment will be ready for her. I've had some adjustments made that the doctors suggested. Grab bars, a special hospital bed." Julia turned to him, touched by his thoughtfulness. "You didn't have to do that." Edward shrugged, a casual gesture that couldn't hide the kindness behind the act. "I want her to be comfortable. Besides, Michael will love to meet her. He needs a grandmother." The casual mention of a broader family relationship made something stir inside Julia. In recent weeks, the line between work and family had become increasingly blurred. It wasn't just Michael who was attached to her. Edward also seemed more and more at ease in her presence. Conversations that were once only about Michael's development now flowed into personal topics, opinions, dreams. Julia found herself eagerly anticipating the moments when Michael took his afternoon nap and she would have coffee with Edward on the terrace, discussing books, music, or simply sharing stories from their very different lives. She spoke of her childhood on the outskirts of London, of the hardships and simple joys. He shared the weight and loneliness that came with power and wealth. It was as if two completely different worlds had found an unexpected intersection. The established routine, however, was interrupted one Thursday afternoon when Edward received a call that left him visibly disturbed. "Is something wrong?" Julia asked when he hung up, noticing his worried expression. Edward hesitated, looking at Michael, who was playing peacefully on the rug between them. "Richard Thorne is coming to London," he finally answered. "He arrives tomorrow." "Who is Richard Thorne?" Julia asked, noting how the mere name had altered Edward's mood. Helen's brother. Michael's uncle and... Edward paused, choosing his words carefully. He's the legal trustee of Michael's trust fund and has a certain influence over matters related to his well-being. Julia felt a shiver of concern. Does he object to me taking care of Michael? He doesn't know about you yet, Edward admitted. Richard is traditional, a prestigious lawyer, extremely focused on credentials, degrees, protocols. You're saying he won't approve of a former cleaner with no formal training taking care of his nephew. It wasn't a question, and Edward didn't try to soften the truth. Richard loved his sister very much, and he loves Michael. He's always wanted the best for the boy in his own way. But his vision of the best usually involves renowned specialists, prestigious institutions, scientifically proven approaches. Edward smiled humorlessly. I don't think intuitive connection is in his vocabulary. Julia looked at Michael, who had lifted his head as if sensing the tension in the room. She immediately softened her expression and spoke to him in a reassuring tone. The boy returned to his play, satisfied. Maybe we should prepare a report, she suggested. Document Michael's progress. Get statements from the doctors and therapists who work with him. Edward looked at her with admiration. You continue to surprise me. Julia, most people would be intimidated or defensive. I'm not here to compete with anyone, she replied simply. I'm here for Michael. If his uncle truly loves him, he'll see that what matters are the results, not my credentials. The next morning, the Blackwood residence was in a state of flurry. Staff moved about hastily, ensuring everything was perfect for Richard Thorne's arrival. Julia observed the general nervousness with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Is he that intimidating? She asked Carmen, the housekeeper who had become an ally and friend in recent weeks. Carmen adjusted an already flawless flower arrangement. Mr. Thorne is demanding. He always has been, even before Mrs. Helen passed. After she was gone, he became even more rigid about everything concerning young Michael. Julia was with Michael in his room when she heard the sound of a car arriving. From the window, she saw a tall, elegant man getting out of a limousine. The resemblance to Helen, whose face she knew from the countless photos scattered around the house, was undeniable. The same piercing green eyes, the same aristocratic bearing. Your uncle is here, Michael, she said softly. The boy looked at her with his big, curious eyes, not fully understanding. Edward had suggested that Julia remain with Michael in his room until he could speak with Richard. I'll prepare the ground, he had explained. Julia agreed, although something inside her rebelled against the idea of hiding, as if there was something wrong or shameful about her role in Michael's life. She could hear voices from downstairs, Edward's deep voice and another, more formal and incisive, which she assumed was Richard's. The tones occasionally rose, indicating the conversation was not going smoothly. About an hour later, the bedroom door opened. Edward entered, accompanied by the man Julia had seen from the window. Richard Thorne was even more imposing up close, tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that certainly cost more than everything Julia had ever owned. Richard, this is Julia Miller, who has been taking care of Michael for the past few weeks. Julia, this is Richard Thorne, Helen's brother and Michael's uncle. Richard examined her with critical eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail, from the simplicity of her dress to her hands, which, despite the beauty treatments Edward had insisted on providing, still showed signs of years of hard work. Miss Miller. He greeted formally without extending his hand. Edward has told me about your unusual arrangement. There was something in the way he said unusual that made Julia straighten her posture, an automatic reflex of dignity. It's a pleasure to meet you. Mr. Thorne, Michael speaks about his uncle a lot. It was a small white lie. Michael still spoke very little, but the comment had the desired effect. Something in Richard's gaze softened minimally. Really? He's speaking? Simple words mostly, Julia explained, turning to the boy who was observing the newcomer cautiously. Michael, look who's here to see you. It's Uncle Richard. To everyone's surprise, especially Richard's, Michael smiled and held out a toy toward his uncle, a gesture of sharing that would have been unthinkable a few weeks earlier. Richard was visibly moved, though he tried to hide it. He approached cautiously and sat on the floor near his nephew, accepting the offered toy with the reverence of someone receiving a priceless treasure. Hi, champ, he said, his voice slightly thick. I've missed you. Michael returned to his play but didn't protest when Richard sat nearby, a monumental progress that did not go unnoticed. "He's different," Richard commented after a few minutes of observation. "More present." "Julia has worked miracles," Edward replied, pride evident in his voice. Richard cast a skeptical glance at Julia. "With all due respect, Miss Miller, what therapeutic method do you use? ABA? Floor time? TH?" Julia was not intimidated by the specialized terminology, an integrated approach. "Mr. Thorne, I adapt elements from different methods according to Michael's specific needs at any given moment." It wasn't exactly a lie. Julia had devoured books and articles on autism in recent weeks, informing herself about all available approaches. But the truth was that her connection with Michael transcended formal methodologies. "And your qualifications are—" Edward intervened before Julia had to answer. "Richard, why don't we continue this conversation over lunch? Michael is comfortable now. Let's not disturb his routine." Lunch was served in the elegant dining room, with Michael seated in his special chair next to Julia. To Richard's surprise, the boy ate by himself, using his spoon with a coordination that seemed new. "He's never eaten like this before," Richard remarked, watching how Michael interacted naturally with Julia, accepting her occasional help without protest. "This is just one of many improvements," Edward replied. "Dr. Santos, the neuropsychiatrist, is impressed with his progress. He says Michael is showing advances that would typically take months, if not years, of intensive therapy." Richard watched everything with a mixture of amazement and suspicion. It was obvious he was happy to see his nephew progressing, but something bothered him. Perhaps the fact that this transformation had come not from the specialists he so valued, but at the hands of a young woman with no formal credentials. After lunch, while Michael was napping, Richard finally addressed the issue directly. "Edward, you know I've always respected your decisions as a father," he began, sitting in the office with a rigid posture. "But as the legal trustee of Michael's fund, and as someone who promised my sister I would always protect her son, I must express my concern." Edward sighed, already anticipating what was to come. "Richard, no, let me finish. It's undeniable that Michael seems to be responding well to Miss Miller's care. I see it with my own eyes, and I am genuinely happy. But you've replaced a team of qualified specialists, with years of training and experience, with a—" He hesitated, clearly searching for a diplomatic word. "With a former cleaner with no relevant training," Julia completed calmly. She had insisted on being part of the meeting despite Edward's concerns. Richard looked at her, surprised by her frankness. "No offense, Miss Miller, but yes. That is precisely my point. Michael is not an ordinary child. He has complex needs, specific challenges. He needs a structured education that will prepare him for the future, especially considering the empire he will one day inherit." "With all due respect, Mr. Thorne," Julia responded without hesitation, "Michael is, above all, a child who lost his mother very young and who spent months unable to connect with the world around him. Before we think about the empire he will inherit, we need to ensure he feels safe, loved, and understood." Richard seemed momentarily taken aback by the direct response. "No one is denying the importance of emotional support," he finally replied. "But there are qualified professionals who can provide that while implementing proven therapeutic protocols." 9 qualified professionals tried and failed, Edward reminded him. Julia achieved in one night what months of expensive therapies could not. She reached Michael. Richard shook his head, frustrated. This could be a temporary bond, a passing fixation. Autistic children sometimes develop intense attachments that can be detrimental in the long run, if not properly managed by professionals. Or it could be exactly what Michael needed, Edward countered. Someone who understands him intuitively, who feels the world as he does. Richard raised an eyebrow. What is that supposed to mean? Edward looked at Julia, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to share. Julia is also on the spectrum, he explained. She was never formally diagnosed due to financial constraints, but she shares many of Michael's sensitivities. That's why he connects so strongly with her. She literally understands his world in a way none of us ever will, no matter how many degrees we hang on the wall. Richard turned to Julia, re-evaluating her with new eyes. You're autistic. We prefer to say neurodivergent, Julia corrected gently. But yes, I have many traits of the spectrum. I understand sensory overload, the need for predictable routines, the difficulty in processing certain social interactions. Something subtly changed in Richard's expression. It wasn't exactly acceptance, but there was a new consideration in his gaze. Still, Michael's formal education. I've already hired a multidisciplinary team that works under Julia's guidance, Edward interjected. Occupational therapists, speech therapists, specialized educators, they all come regularly, but they follow the approach that is working. Julia is the center of this system, the constant that Michael needs. Richard was silent for a long moment, clearly torn between his traditional view of what was best for Michael and the undeniable evidence of the progress he had witnessed. I need time to properly assess the situation, he said finally. I'll be in London for 2 weeks. During that time, I'd like to observe Miss Miller's work with Michael, consult with the professionals who attend to him, and review his progress reports. Edward exchanged a look with Julia, who nodded. Perfectly reasonable, Edward agreed. In fact, we were expecting your visit and have prepared comprehensive documentation of Michael's progress over the last few weeks. Julia opened a folder she had set aside and handed it to Richard. Inside were not only detailed development reports, but also videos, testimonials from doctors and therapists, and a meticulous journal of daily routines and activities. Richard leafed through the material, visibly impressed with the organization and depth. I see you are more methodical than I had presumed. Miss Miller, Julia smiled faintly. Another common trait on the spectrum, Mr. Thorne, we tend to be quite systematic. For the first time since his arrival, Richard let out a small smile. Apparently I have much to learn. That night, after Richard had retired to the guest room, Edward found Julia on the terrace, watching the city lights in the distance. You were incredible today, he said, joining her at the railing. Richard is intimidating even to CEOs and politicians, and you stood up to him without flinching. Julia smiled, though there was a shadow of worry in her eyes. I didn't stand up to him. I just defended what I believe is best for Michael. He's impressed, you know. Richard doesn't admit it easily, but I saw how he watched you with Michael. He's starting to reconsider his prejudices. They're not prejudices, Julia mused. He just loves his nephew and wants to ensure he has the best possible care. I can't blame him for questioning my qualifications. Edward studied her in the soft glow of the garden lights. Something had shifted between them in recent weeks, a subtle tension, a mutual awareness that went beyond a professional relationship or even friendship. You always see the best in people, don't you? Julia shrugged. I grew up in a place where people were judged hastily all the time. I know how much that hurts. Edward moved a little closer. There's something I didn't tell you about Richard's visit, he admitted, his voice lower. He didn't just come to evaluate your approach with Michael. Julia turned to him, intrigued. No, he heard rumors. About us. Us? Julia repeated, feeling her heart speed up. Apparently some of the staff have noticed a certain closeness between us. Comments were made, speculation circulated. Edward seemed strangely vulnerable now. Richard came to verify if the rumors are true. Julia felt her face grow warm. What rumors exactly? That the widowed billionaire is romantically involved with his son's nanny. Edward looked at her directly now. That he's risking the boy's emotional stability for a personal attraction. The silence that followed was heavy with unresolved tension. Julia looked away, feeling suddenly exposed. There's nothing for Richard to verify, she said finally, her voice controlled. There is no us in that sense, isn't there? Edward asked softly. The question hung between them like an unexplored possibility, an untrodden path. Julia felt the gravitational pull of that moment, how her answer could alter the course of everything. There can't be, she finally replied. Not now. Michael needs stability, consistency. He needs to know that I'm here for him unconditionally. She paused, gathering the courage for complete honesty. And you need to be sure that my feelings for Michael aren't connected to any other thing. Edward nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Your integrity is one of the many things I admire about you, Julia Miller. He reached out, lightly touching her hand on the railing. A brief, respectful touch, yet laden with unspoken promise. Good night, he said simply. before turning and going back inside the house. Julia remained on the terrace long after he had left, contemplating not just the city lights, but also the unexpected complexities her life had become. From an invisible cleaner to the centerpiece of an elite family. From a life of struggling for survival to a world of limitless possibilities. And now this new uncharted territory, feelings emerging in circumstances that made their expression almost impossible. What had started with a burst pipe in the middle of the night continued to unfold in directions Julia could never have foreseen. And as the stars shone over London, she wondered where this current would take her next. In the days that followed, Richard Thorne became a constant presence at the Blackwood residence. His observant eyes missed no detail of the interaction between Julia and Michael, methodically analyzing every technique, every response, every small step of progress. What had begun as a critical evaluation, however, gradually transformed into something akin to reluctant admiration. "He was never like this with me," Richard commented one morning, watching as Michael sat comfortably on his lap while Julia read a story to them both. "Even before Helen passed, he was always reserved with me." Julia smiled, turning another page of the illustrated book. "Children on the spectrum are very perceptive, Mr. Thorne. They sense our anxiety, our expectations. When we relax and accept them as they are, without trying to fit them into our expectations, the connection happens naturally." Richard reflected on those words, gently adjusting Michael on his lap. "You're saying I was pushing him too hard?" It wasn't a question, and Julia appreciated his self-awareness. "I'm saying your love for him was expressed in a way he had trouble processing," she replied diplomatically. "Now you're learning his language." The lawyer nodded slowly, and for a moment, Julia glimpsed the vulnerable man behind the facade of authority. Someone who had also suffered a devastating loss when his sister died. Someone whose rigidity was perhaps just a way to control a world that had become painfully unpredictable. That afternoon, while Michael was napping, Richard asked to speak with Julia privately. They went to the garden, walking slowly among meticulously tended flower beds. "I was unfair to you, Miss Miller," Richard began, surprising Julia with his frankness. "I came here with preconceived notions about who you were and what your motivations might be." "It's understandable," Julia replied. "I want to protect your nephew." "Yes, but I've also realized that my definition of protecting was limited by my own worldview." He stopped in front of a rosebush, gently touching one of the flowers. "I'm a man who has always lived in structured environments, elite universities, prestigious law firms, exclusive social circles. I believed that this structure, this order, was what Michael needed. And now?" Richard smiled faintly. "Now I understand that I was trying to fit Michael into my world, when what he really needed was someone who could enter his." He turned to face her directly. "Someone like you." Julia felt a lump in her throat, moved by the unexpected recognition. "Thank you for trusting me." "It wasn't easy," Richard admitted with a soft laugh. "I'm a proud and stubborn man. Helen always said that was my worst quality." The mention of his sister brought a shadow of sadness to his eyes, which soon dissipated. "She would have liked you," he added, surprising Julia again. "Helen always valued authenticity above all else. That's what drew her to Edward, despite their social differences." "Social differences?" Julia asked, curious. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Edward never told you?" "He wasn't born with a silver spoon, Miss Miller. He came from modest origins, not so different from your own. He built his empire from scratch, with almost obstinate determination." This revelation surprised Julia. Edward Blackwood seemed so perfectly at ease in his world of privilege that it was hard to imagine him coming from anywhere else. "Helen was the heiress," Richard continued. "Our family has been in London's high society for generations. When she brought Edward home, an ambitious young man from a humble background who had won a scholarship to the same university she attended, our parents nearly had a breakdown." He smiled at the memory. "But Helen always knew what she wanted, and Edward proved his worth many times over. When he turned a small initial investment into a tech empire that surpassed the family's traditional businesses, even my father had to swallow his pride and admit she had chosen well." Julia absorbed this information, reconfiguring her understanding of Edward. "Why did he never mention it?" "Edward doesn't like to talk about the past," Richard replied. He's a man focused on the future, always has been, but I thought you should know. Perhaps it helps to understand why he trusted you so readily, despite the unusual circumstances." They continued walking in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Richard spoke again, his tone now more formal. "I will be returning to Manchester tomorrow. My report as legal trustee will recommend maintaining the current arrangement, with you as Michael's primary caregiver, on the condition that you continue to work in conjunction with the multidisciplinary team." The relief Julia felt was immense. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "Richard, please," he corrected with a slight smile. "We're practically family now." That word, family, resonated deeply with Julia. In the past few weeks, the boundary between work and belonging had become increasingly blurred. Michael would call her Mama in his babbling. Edward treated her as an indispensable partner, and now even Richard recognized her as part of the family circle. It was a feeling both comforting and unsettling, as if she had found a place where she finally belonged, yet still feared it could all fall apart at any moment. That evening, Edward organized a farewell dinner for Richard. The table was elegantly set, with Michael seated in his special chair, wearing a small formal outfit that made him look like a miniature version of his father. "A toast," Edward proposed, raising his glass. "To new beginnings and open minds." Richard raised his own glass. "And to extraordinary people who teach us to see beyond our limitations." His gaze met Julia's, who blushed slightly at the implied compliment. The evening passed in pleasant conversation, occasionally interrupted by Michael, who, to everyone's delight, was exceptionally communicative, pointing at objects and trying to repeat words, Julia said. After dinner, once Michael was asleep, and Richard had retired to finalize his travel preparations, Edward invited Julia for a glass of wine on the terrace, a ritual that had become increasingly frequent between them. "Richard told me you two had a good talk today," he commented, handing her a crystal glass of red wine. Julia nodded, leaning against the railing. "He's a better man than I initially thought. Just very protective of Michael." "Richard has always been the family's guardian," Edward reflected. "Even when we were young, he already saw himself as Helen's protector. He told me about your origins," Julia mentioned, watching Edward's reaction. "Said you weren't born into wealth." Edward was momentarily surprised, then let out a short laugh. "Richard is getting sentimental in his old age. He never talks about the past." "Why did you never mention it?" Edward shrugged, taking a sip of wine before answering. "It never seemed relevant. Besides, I was afraid it might sound like, I don't know, like I was trying to establish some kind of forced connection with you. A connection based on humble origins," Julia smiled. "Would that be so terrible?" "It would be dishonest," Edward answered seriously. "Yes, I was born on the outskirts of London. My father was a mechanic, my mother a seamstress. I got a scholarship to study engineering and business, worked like crazy, seized a few crucial opportunities, and here I am." He gestured to encompass the luxurious residence. "But that was so long ago that it sometimes feels like someone else's story. The world I live in now is so different that any comparison to my origins would be superficial." Julia studied him intently. "Are you ashamed of where you came from?" "Not at all," Edward replied promptly. "I'm proud of my origins, of the work ethic my parents taught me. I just didn't want you to think I was trying to say, I understand your struggle, when frankly, it's been decades since I've faced the challenges you have." There was a disarming honesty in his words that Julia deeply appreciated. "I understand. And I appreciate your sincerity." They stood in silence for a few moments, watching the city lights. It was a clear night, and even with London's light pollution, a few stars were visible. "Richard also mentioned something else," Julia said finally, gathering her courage. "About you and Helen, that you were from different worlds. But she saw something in you beyond appearances." Edward smiled at the memory, a melancholic smile. "Helen was extraordinary. While everyone else saw just an ambitious scholarship student, she saw possibilities that even I couldn't see in myself." He paused, looking at Julia. She had this rare ability to look past circumstances, directly into a person's essence. "Michael inherited that from her," Julia observed softly. Edward nodded. "Yes, that's why he chose you, Julia. It wasn't coincidence or luck. It was as if he could see something in you that the rest, of the world couldn't. The intensity of his gaze made Julia turn her face away, suddenly aware of the proximity between them, of the growing intimacy of their shared moments. "Edward," she began hesitantly, "about what we talked about a few days ago, about the rumors—" "They aren't just rumors, are they?" Edward interrupted gently, placing his glass on the railing. "At least not on my part." Julia's heart sped up. It was the first time either of them had so directly verbalized what was happening between them. "Not on my part either," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "But it complicates everything. Life is complicated, Julia. Relationships are complicated. Families are complicated." Edward turned to face her completely now. "The question is, should we give up on something potentially wonderful just because it's complicated?" "It's not that simple," Julia argued, though her resolve was visibly weakening. "There's Michael to consider. There's my job. There's what other people will think. Michael adores you regardless of the title you hold. As for your job, if that's a concern, we can completely renegotiate our agreement. And as for what other people will think," Edward smiled, "I learned a long time ago that living to meet others' expectations is the surest path to unhappiness." He moved a little closer, not invading her space but making his intention clear. "I'm not asking for a decision now. I just want you to know that when you're ready, when you feel the time is right, I'll be here." The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes were almost unbearable for Julia. This man, who commanded an empire and faced ruthless business adversaries daily, stood before her completely disarmed, offering his heart without guarantees. "I need time," was all she could manage to say. Edward nodded, respectfully backing away. "All the time you need." The moment was interrupted by the intercom system. It was Carmen, the housekeeper. "Mr. Blackwood, sorry to bother you, but there's an urgent call from the editor of Business and Power magazine. They're requesting a comment on a story they plan to publish tomorrow." Edward frowned. "What story?" "It's about you and—" "Miss Miller, sir. Apparently someone photographed you during your walk in the park with young Michael last Sunday." Julia felt a shiver of apprehension. The outing had been a rare moment of normality. Michael was having a particularly good day, and they had decided to risk a brief visit to Hyde Park. They had been discreet, but evidently not enough. "I'll take it in the office," Edward replied, his tone now serious. He turned to Julia. "Don't worry. It's probably just baseless gossip. I'll handle it." But something in his eyes betrayed his concern, and Julia knew instinctively that this was just the beginning of a bigger storm. Edward returned almost an hour later, finding Julia still on the terrace, now wrapped in a shawl against the night breeze. His expression was grave. "How bad is it?" she asked directly. Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Julia had come to recognize as a sign of stress. "They're publishing it tomorrow. The photos aren't compromising, just the three of us in the park, walking, talking. But the narrative they've built—" "What narrative exactly?" "The opportunist with the mop bucket, that's the headline," Edward replied, not hiding his disgust. "They're suggesting you're an ambitious cleaner who seduced a vulnerable billionaire and is manipulating a special needs child to secure access to the family fortune." Julia felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Though she had spent her life facing prejudice, she had never experienced this kind of malicious public scrutiny. "How did they find out?" "About me, about my previous job?" "Someone on the inside leaked the information," Edward answered, the anger evident in his controlled voice. "I'm investigating, but I have my suspicions." "The previous nanny," Julia concluded. "She never accepted being replaced by me." Edward nodded. "Probably. What matters now is how we respond to this." "Can we sue the magazine?" Julia suggested, trying to stay calm. "We can and we will. But that won't stop the story from circulating. In the digital age, once something is published, it never completely disappears." Edward seemed genuinely disturbed. "I'm so sorry, Julia, you don't deserve this." "It's not your fault," she replied automatically, though a part of her knew that wasn't entirely true. After all, it was her association with Edward, with this world she didn't belong to, that had exposed her to this kind of attack. "What do they want exactly?" she asked. "A comment? A denial? What they want doesn't matter," Edward answered firmly. "What matters is protecting you and Michael from this unnecessary exposure." "And how do we do that?" Edward hesitated, and Julia realized he was struggling with something. "There's a suggestion from the company's public relations department." He seemed uncomfortable. "They recommend we make a formal statement, clarifying that you are simply a qualified employee, hired specifically for your experience with neurodivergent children, and that any insinuation of a personal relationship is completely false." Julia felt a pang of hurt, but kept her expression neutral. "A convenient lie." "A necessary simplification," Edward corrected gently. "For now. Just until the storm passes." "And how long would that take? A month? A year? Forever?" Julia couldn't contain the bitterness in her voice. "That's how it would work, isn't it? In public, I'm the respectable nanny. In private, I'm—" "What, exactly?" Edward took a step toward her. "Julia, that's not what I want. You know that. I'm just trying to protect all of us while we find a better way." "I understand," she replied, and she truly did. "But I also understand that this is just the beginning. There will always be someone questioning my presence in your lives. Always a new story, always speculation." She paused, looking out at the city stretching below them, a reminder of the vast social distance that still separated them, despite all their emotional closeness. "Maybe Richard was right at the beginning," she said finally. "Maybe Michael really does need someone with formal qualifications, someone whose presence doesn't cause this kind of scandal, someone who naturally belongs in this world." "Don't say that," Edward pleaded, urgency clear in his voice. "Don't let these petty tabloids define who you are or what your place is. Michael chose you. I chose you." The intensity of his declaration struck Julia deeply. There was truth there, a truth that went beyond social conventions and external expectations, yet there was also the practical reality of their situation, a reality that couldn't be ignored simply by force of will. "I need to think," she said finally. "This is all happening too fast." Edward nodded, respecting her request for space. "Of course. Take all the time you need. In the meantime, I'll deal with the press as best I can." He hesitated briefly before adding, "Just remember that no matter what they say out there, what we have here, you, me, and Michael, is real. And it's worth fighting for." With those words, Edward left her alone on the terrace, lost in increasingly turbulent thoughts. Later, in her apartment in the annex, Julia couldn't sleep. The prospect of being portrayed as an opportunist in a national magazine tormented her. Not for herself. She had faced far worse prejudice in her life, but for Michael and for her mother. How would Nora react to seeing her daughter's name dragged through the mud? How would it affect her treatment, her recovery? And Michael, as young as he was, would he somehow be impacted by all this negativity surrounding his caregiver? Her phone vibrated with a message from Edward. "No matter what happens tomorrow, we're in this together. Trust me." Those simple words brought tears to her eyes. Julia realized that despite all the complications, she had found something precious at the Blackwood residence. Not just a job or a connection with Michael, but a genuine partnership, a mutual understanding that transcended social barriers. The question now was whether that bond would be strong enough to withstand the approaching storm, and whether she would have the courage to stand firm when the world tried to convince her that she didn't belong. With these conflicting thoughts, Julia finally fell asleep, unaware that as she struggled with her doubts, far more powerful forces were already in motion to permanently separate what fate had so unexpectedly brought together on that night of a burst pipe. The next morning dawned with the weight of an impending storm. Julia woke to the insistent sound of her phone. It was Carmen, the housekeeper, her voice trembling with concern. "Miss Julia, Mr. Blackwood asks that you don't go online or answer any unknown calls today. The article, it's been published." Julia felt a knot in her stomach. "How bad is it, Carmen?" The housekeeper's hesitation was answer enough. "Mr. Blackwood has been in a video conference with the board of directors since 6 this morning. He asked me to tell you he will come and speak with you himself as soon as he can." After hanging up, Julia sat on the edge of her bed, trying to process the situation. Part of her wanted to ignore the advice and see exactly what was being said about her, but another part, perhaps the wiser one, preferred to remain in momentary ignorance. She decided to focus on what truly mattered. Michael. As always, he would be her center, her absolute priority. She went to the main house where she found the boy having breakfast with Mrs. Gable. Upon seeing her, Michael immediately reached out his arms, his little face lighting up with a genuine smile. "Mama!" he exclaimed, one of the few words he could pronounce clearly. Julia picked him up, hugging him with an intensity that surprised even herself. In that embrace, she sought an anchor amidst the storm brewing around them. "Good morning, my little one," she whispered against his soft hair. "We're going to have a special day today, just the two of us." Mrs. Gable gave her a compassionate look. "The boy is lively today. Slept through the night, no nightmares." Another milestone that under normal circumstances would be widely celebrated. Today, however, a shadow hung over every small victory. Julia decided to spend the morning with Michael in the activity room, a space specially designed with sensory equipment that had been installed based on her recommendations. There, isolated from the outside world, they could exist in their own bubble of mutual understanding. It was there that Edward found them, shortly after noon. His face showed the strain of hours of corporate confrontations, but it visibly softened upon seeing Michael playing peacefully with building blocks, while Julia narrated a story related to the shapes he was creating. "Looks like you two are having a productive morning," he commented, forcing a light tone that couldn't completely mask his concern. "We're creating our own world," Julia replied, the metaphor not lost on him. Edward crouched beside his son, who offered him a red block, a gesture of inclusion that would have been unthinkable a few months prior. After a few moments of playing together, he looked at Julia. "Can we talk? Mrs. Gable can stay with Michael for a few minutes." In the office, Edward wasted no time on pleasantries. "The situation is more complicated than we anticipated," he said, handing her a tablet with the Business and Power magazine article on the screen. "See for yourself." The main headline hit Julia with brutal force: "The cleaner who seduced an empire." Below it, a photo of her and Edward in the park, walking side by side while Michael was in Julia's arms. The image itself was innocent, but the angle and proximity suggested an intimacy that, while real, had never been so publicly exposed. The text was even more devastating, a carefully constructed narrative that twisted every genuine detail of their story into something sordid. Her humble background was described as a convenient backdrop for an ambitious social climber. Her special connection with Michael was portrayed as emotional manipulation of a vulnerable child. Even Nora's treatment was presented as the price paid by the billionaire to keep his mistress satisfied. Julia couldn't finish the sentence, feeling nauseous as she read on. "Pure defamation," Edward completed, the anger evident in his controlled voice. "I've already engaged our legal department. We're going to sue the magazine for every word." But it wasn't just the article itself that disturbed her. It was also the mentioned repercussions: shares of the Blackwood Group falling on the stock market, investors expressing concern, and, most alarmingly, a note about how the case could potentially affect pending international deals with extremely conservative Japanese partners. "Your empire is being damaged because of me," Julia stated, her voice barely audible. "Not because of you," Edward corrected firmly, "because of sensationalist journalism and class prejudice. You are not to blame for any of this." "But the reality remains," Julia insisted. "Your reputation, your business, they're suffering because you brought me into your life." Edward moved closer, holding her hands with intensity. "Listen to me, Julia. Businesses rise and fall. Reputations get tarnished and rebuilt. This is temporary. What we have here, you, me, Michael, that's what truly matters." It was everything Julia wanted to hear, everything her heart longed to believe. However, before she could respond, the office door opened abruptly, revealing Gregory Miles, the CFO of the Blackwood Group and a senior board member. "Edward, sorry to interrupt, but the Japanese partners just called. They're threatening to cancel the deal if we don't resolve this situation immediately." He cast a meaningful glance at Julia before continuing. "The board is gathered in the conference room. They demand your presence and a decision." Edward took a deep breath, the conflict evident in his eyes. "I'll be there in 5 minutes, Gregory." When they were alone again, Edward turned to Julia, who had already stepped back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the chasm that suddenly seemed to be opening between them. Don't make any rash decisions, he pleaded, urgency clear in his voice. This will pass. We'll find a solution together. Julia nodded mechanically, but something inside her was already crystallizing into a painful certainty. The world Edward belonged to, with its boards of directors, Japanese partners, and billions at stake, would never easily accept a Julia Miller, a former cleaner from the city's outskirts, as a legitimate part of the equation. Go to your meeting, she said simply. Michael needs me now. As Edward headed to the corporate battlefield, Julia returned to Michael. She found him still playing calmly, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. How long would this protective bubble last? How long until these malicious stories somehow reached him? Perhaps through other children when he eventually started school. The afternoon passed in a strange, superficial normality. Julia maintained Michael's routine, finding refuge in the predictability of daily activities. On the outside, she was the same efficient, loving caregiver. Inside, a fierce battle raged. It was during Michael's afternoon nap that her phone vibrated with a notification. It was a message from Carmen. Mrs. Nora is asking for you. She sounds agitated. Julia's heart leaped. Her mother rarely called during the day, respecting her work schedule. Something had to be wrong. She returned the call immediately. Mum, is everything okay? Nora's voice was trembling, but not from physical weakness. Julia, what is this story they're telling about you? The nurse showed me a report on her tablet. They're saying horrible things, darling. Julia closed her eyes, feeling the pain of exposure spreading like poison. It had now reached even her mother, who was still recovering from a serious illness. Mum, they're lies. Don't worry about it. How can I not worry? They're calling you an opportunist, a gold digger. I raised you better than that, Julia. I raised you to be honest, hard-working. The hurt in Nora's voice was palpable, and Julia realized the damage went beyond her own reputation. It was her family's legacy, the values her mother had sacrificed so much to instill in her, that were now being publicly questioned. I know. Mum, and I am everything you taught me to be, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. What they're saying has nothing to do with who I really am. Then why are they saying it? Where did they get this whole story? Julia hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. It's complicated, Mum. There are feelings involved. Real, true feelings, but nothing like they're portraying. The silence on the other end of the line was brief but significant. You've fallen in love with him, Nora concluded, with no need to specify who he was. Oh, Julia. There was no accusation in her voice, only a melancholic understanding of the complications such a feeling would inevitably bring. It wasn't planned. Mum, it happened naturally over time as we took care of Michael together. And now? Nora asked. What's going to happen now, darling? It was the question Julia had been avoiding since she saw the headline that morning. I don't know, she finally admitted. But I have to do what's best for Michael. He's already lost one mother. I can't let him suffer more because of a situation we've created. And what's best for you, Julia? Who's thinking about that? The question hit Julia like an unexpected wave, washing away carefully constructed defenses. All her life she had put others first. First her mother, then Michael. She rarely asked herself what she needed, what would be best for her own heart. I'll be fine. Mum, she replied automatically. The same answer she had always given since childhood, whenever Nora worried about her selflessness. After hanging up, Julia sat beside Michael's crib, watching the boy sleep peacefully. How easy it would be to simply run away, to pack her things and disappear, sparing everyone the prolonged drama. But that would be unforgivable. Michael had already suffered a devastating loss. He couldn't just wake up one day to find another person he loved had vanished without explanation. Whatever her decision, it would need to be implemented with the utmost care to minimize the impact on this child who had innocently chosen to trust her when he trusted no one else. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Edward's return. When he entered the room, Julia immediately sensed that something had changed. There was a new gravity in his eyes, a painful resignation that wasn't there before. How was the meeting? She asked, though she already feared the answer. Edward sat heavily in the nearby armchair, running a hand over his face in a gesture of exhaustion. The Japanese partners threatened to cancel the deal, a $10 billion contract we spent 2 years negotiating. He spoke without emotion, just stating facts. The board is in a panic. Shareholders are calling. The financial press is speculating about my emotional stability to lead the group. Julia felt each word as an additional weight on her already burdened shoulders. What do they want you to do? What do you think? Edward replied with a bitter smile. They want me to dismiss you immediately, to hire an appropriately qualified team for Michael, to issue a formal statement denying any personal involvement. Julia nodded slowly, the confirmation of her worst fears. And what are you going to do? Edward looked up, and there was a steely determination in his eyes now. I'm going to fight. For you, for Michael, for us. I've faced down boards of directors before. I've rebuilt companies from the ground up. I can do it again if I have to. There was a nobility in his stance that deeply touched Julia, but also a recklessness that frightened her. This wasn't a simple business challenge. It was a man's life, a son's stability, the future of thousands of employees who depended on the Blackwood Group. You can't sacrifice everything for me, she said softly. It's not a sacrifice when it's for something that truly matters. Julia stood up, needing to create physical distance to maintain mental clarity. Edward, be realistic. You built this empire with hard work. It's the legacy you'll leave for Michael one day. You can't risk it all for a feeling that might not even have a chance to properly flourish in this hostile environment. Edward stood up too, frustration evident in every line of his tense body. So, what do you suggest? That I just surrender? That I let people who know nothing about us dictate how we should live our lives? I'm suggesting we be prudent, Julia replied, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Michael. That we think about what's best for everyone involved, especially for your son. Michael needs you, Edward insisted. You saw how he was before. You saw the transformation since you arrived. And I can continue to help, just in a different way. The words came out with difficulty, each one like a small stab to her own heart. Maybe it's best if I step away for a while. Give things time to calm down. Edward studied her for a long moment, a painful understanding dawning in his eyes. You've already decided, haven't you? Regardless of what I say. It wasn't an accusation, just a sad statement of fact. Julia felt tears welling up, but refused to let them fall. Not here, not now, when she needed to maintain her composure for the difficult conversation that would follow. I haven't made any final decisions, she replied, though they both knew it was only partly true. But I think we need to be realistic about the forces we're up against. Edward came closer, taking her hands in his. Julia, look at me. Since Helen died, I've been living like a ghost in my own life. Functioning but not really living. You and Michael brought me back. I'm not ready to give that up, to give us up. The raw sincerity in his voice almost made Julia reconsider. Almost. I'm not talking about giving up, she corrected gently. I'm talking about a strategic retreat, about giving you time to resolve the situation with your business while I step out of the media spotlight for a bit. And what about Michael? You'll just disappear from his life? The question hit the most sensitive spot, the worry that tormented her most. Of course not. I would never do that to him. We'd need to create a careful transition plan, perhaps with regular visits that gradually decrease as he adapts to a new caregiver. Every word of that proposal tore something inside Julia. The idea of gradually distancing herself from Michael, of seeing those trusting eyes possibly shut down to the world again, was almost unbearable. But even more unbearable would be to be the cause of the collapse of the world Edward had built for him. This is madness, Edward protested, releasing her hands and stepping back. We're letting petty, prejudiced people dictate our lives. We're being realistic, Julia corrected. Your world has its own rules, Edward. Rules that weren't made for people like me. Then we'll change the rules. The intensity of his response made Michael stir restlessly in his crib. Julia quickly went to the boy, soothing him with gentle touches before turning her attention back to Edward. It's not that simple. And you know it, she said, keeping her voice calm with conscious effort. Some battles can't be won with determination alone. A heavy silence settled between them, filled with unspoken words and possibilities that seemed increasingly distant. It was Edward who finally broke it. I'm willing to fight for us. Julia, I just need to know if you are too. The question hung in the air like a silent challenge, demanding an answer Julia wasn't sure she was ready to give. Before she could respond, her phone vibrated with a notification. It was a message from Richard Thorne. "Just saw the news. I'm returning to London. We must discuss Michael's well-being immediately. I'll be there tomorrow morning." Julia showed the message to Edward, whose face visibly tensed. "Richard promised to support our arrangement," he commented bitterly. "It seems even he has been swayed by this smear campaign. Or maybe he's genuinely concerned about Michael," Julia suggested, always trying to see the best in people's intentions. "Either way, this complicates things even further." Michael began to wake up, his little eyes slowly opening. Seeing Julia and Edward near the crib, he smiled that innocent, trusting smile that had become increasingly frequent in recent weeks. He reached his arms out to Julia, who automatically picked him up, her body responding to the boy's call before her mind could even process the movement. "Dada," Michael called, extending a small hand toward Edward, who immediately moved closer. It was a scene that, in other circumstances, would be simply a family and a tender, everyday moment. Now it seemed to have transformed into a minefield of implications and consequences. "Let's take this one step at a time," Julia suggested, holding Michael while including Edward in her space. "First, let's talk to Richard tomorrow. Hear his concerns, present our point of view." Edward nodded, though the tension hadn't completely left his face. "And in the meantime, we live one day at a time," Julia replied with a wisdom born from years of facing uncertainty. "And we put Michael first, always." That night, after Michael was put to bed, Julia returned to her apartment in the annex. She felt the weight of every step, as if walking on ground that could crumble at any moment. Her phone rang. It was her mother again. "Julia, we need to talk," Nora said without preamble. "I've been thinking a lot about all of this." "Me too, Mum," Julia admitted, letting herself sink into the sofa, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "I think I'm going to have to step away for a while. Give Edward space to handle this situation without me at the center of the storm." "Is that really what you want?" Nora asked, her voice gentle but piercing. "Want?" Julia repeated, the word sounding almost foreign. "I don't know if this is about what I want, Mum. It's about what needs to be done. Darling, I spent my whole life doing what needed to be done. I sacrificed desires, dreams, opportunities, all for what I considered my duty." There was a new strength in Nora's voice, an urgency that surprised Julia. "And you know what I realized during my illness? That life is too short to postpone our happiness for the sake of others' expectations. It's not that simple, Mum." "It's never simple, Julia. True love is never simple. But it's rare, too precious to be wasted out of fear or pride." Her mother's words reverberated in Julia, awakening questions she had been avoiding confronting directly. What if it doesn't work out? What if in the end all this sacrifice is for nothing? Sam, and what if it does work out? Nora countered. What if it's exactly as it's meant to be? You've spent your whole life taking care of others. Of me, now of Michael. Maybe it's time you let someone take care of you too. After hanging up, Julia stayed awake for hours, reflecting on her mother's unexpected wisdom. There was truth there, a truth that went beyond practical considerations of media scandals and corporate contracts. Love, in its purest essence, was an act of courage, the courage to risk, to be vulnerable, to believe that something extraordinary could flourish even in the most unlikely soil. When she finally fell asleep, her mind was filled not with certainties, but with possibilities, some terrifying, others exhilarating, all profoundly transformative. And as she dreamed on the other side of the city, Richard Thorne was disembarking from a late-night flight, determined to protect his nephew from what he considered a potentially damaging situation. In his briefcase, an emergency court petition that could irrevocably change the course of all those lives intertwined by fate. Richard Thorne's arrival at the Blackwood residence the next morning brought with it the dense atmosphere of a storm about to break. His face, usually composed and diplomatic, was etched with a stern determination that prompted Carmen, the housekeeper, to call Edward immediately. "Where is my nephew?" were his first words upon entering the main hall, without even waiting for formal greetings. "Michael is with Julia in the activity room," Edward replied, appearing at the top of the staircase. His tone was controlled, but there was an underlying tension that did not go unnoticed. "Good morning to you too, Richard." The two men faced each other for a moment, decades of shared history suddenly strained by the current situation. "We need to talk," Richard announced, slightly raising the briefcase he was carrying, in private. In the office, with the doors closed, Richard wasted no time on pleasantries. "This has to end, Edward," he declared, placing copies of various magazines and newspapers on the desk, all featuring sensationalist headlines about the Blackwood scandal. "Do you have any idea of the damage you're causing? Not just to your reputation, but to Michael's future." Edward remained impassive, though a tense muscle in his jaw betrayed his restrained irritation. "The only damage is being caused by an irresponsible press and people incapable of understanding that genuine connections can exist beyond social class and academic credentials." Richard shook his head, like a disappointed teacher with a bright but stubborn student. "I've always admired your determination, Edward. It's what made you the man you are today. But this time, your obstinacy is jeopardizing everything you've built for Michael." "Michael is better than he has ever been since Helen passed," Edward countered, rising to face his brother-in-law on equal terms. "You saw that yourself when you were here. I saw a child responding well to someone who gives him their full attention. That doesn't mean she's the only one capable of providing such care." Richard opened his briefcase, taking out some documents. "I've consulted with the top child development specialists in the country. They all agree that while Michael may have formed a bond with Miss Miller, a proper transition to qualified professionals would not cause permanent harm, especially if done gradually and in a structured manner." Edward felt a pang of alarm upon seeing the official documents in Richard's hands. "What exactly are you proposing?" Richard placed the papers on the desk, pushing them toward Edward. "As the legal trustee of Michael's trust fund and co-responsible for decisions regarding his well-being, I am requesting a judicial review of the current situation. It's not a custody proceeding," he added quickly, seeing Edward's expression harden. "Just a measure to ensure that decisions related to Michael's education and care are made based on objective criteria, not on momentary emotional entanglements." Edward flipped through the documents, his indignation growing with each page. "You're questioning my fitness as a father," he accused, his voice dangerously low. "I'm questioning your recent decisions as a father," Richard corrected. "There's a crucial difference." Before Edward could respond, a light knock on the door interrupted the escalating tension. Julia entered carrying Michael, who smiled upon seeing his uncle. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, immediately sensing the charged atmosphere, "but Michael wanted to show Uncle Richard something." The boy proudly held up a colorful drawing, mostly scribbles, but with a concentration of colors that formed something vaguely recognizable as a human figure. "Unka!" Michael exclaimed, pointing to the drawing and then to Richard, trying to say uncle in his limited speech. The innocent gesture momentarily diffused the tension. Richard approached, genuinely touched. "Is this for me, champ?" he asked gently, accepting the paper Michael proudly held out to him. "This is the first drawing you've ever given me," Julia smiled, but her smile faltered as she noticed the documents scattered on Edward's desk and his grim expression. "Perhaps we should come back later," she suggested, starting to retreat. "No," both Edward and Richard said simultaneously. "Actually, your presence is timely, Miss Miller," Richard added, carefully placing Michael's drawing in the inner pocket of his jacket. "This conversation concerns you directly as well." Julia felt a shiver of apprehension, but kept her expression serene for Michael, who was watching the adults with the heightened sensitivity typical of children on the spectrum. "Michael, how about we show Uncle Richard that new sensory game you love?" Edward suggested, trying to create a lighter environment for his son. "The one in the activity room." The four of them moved to the specially designed space, where Michael quickly became engaged with his favorite toys, momentarily absorbed in his own world, allowing the adults to speak in low voices a short distance away. Richard observed his nephew for a few moments, his expression visibly softening. "He really is different," he admitted, turning to Julia. "More present, more connected." "It's the result of months of collaborative work," Julia replied. "Not just mine, but the entire team Edward has assembled. Occupational therapists, speech therapists, all following a consistent approach centered on Michael's specific needs. And who coordinates this team? Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. Julia does, Edward answered without hesitation. She is the point of reference, the constant Michael needs. The specialists come and go, but she remains, creating the emotional stability that allows everything else to work. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture very much like his sister's when she was torn between her heart and her head. I'm not questioning the results, he admitted. I'm concerned about the sustainability of the current situation, especially in the face of this media circus. He handed Julia one of the magazines he had brought. The headline screamed, "Manipulative Cleaner, How a Girl from the Outskirts Seduced One of Britain's Most Powerful Men." This will eventually affect Michael, Richard continued, his voice gentler now, addressing Julia directly. When he starts interacting with other children, when he goes to school, these stories will follow him. Julia felt the weight of those words, the same weight that had kept her awake for nights on end. I know, she replied simply. That's why I suggested to Edward that it might be best for me to step away for a while, to give things time to normalize. No, Edward intervened firmly. We've already discussed this. I will not allow baseless rumors and class prejudice to dictate the most important decisions in our lives. Richard observed the exchange between the two with new eyes. Noticing something he might have previously overlooked, the dynamic between Edward and Julia was not that of an employer and employee, nor even of circumstantial allies united for Michael's sake. There was a deep mutual respect, a harmony he rarely saw even in long-established couples. You genuinely care for each other, he stated, more to himself than to them. It wasn't a question but a revelation. Yes, Edward replied without hesitation, and I won't give that up to satisfy outdated social expectations or to appease conservative investors. Julia remained silent, her eyes fixed on Michael, who was now manipulating colored blocks with a concentration that would have been unthinkable months before. Edward, Richard said finally, I am not withdrawing the court petition. Not because I don't trust your judgment as a father, or because I disapprove of Miss Miller, but because I believe we need an impartial professional assessment of this entire situation for Michael's sake. And who would be impartial in this case? Edward questioned. Other elite specialists who share your prejudices about who is qualified to care for a special needs child. The court will appoint independent experts, Richard explained. People with the proper training to evaluate not only Michael's development, but also the dynamics of this entire situation. Edward was about to protest again when Julia finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. Maybe that's not a bad idea, Edward. Both Edward and Richard looked at her in surprise. I've thought a lot about all of this, Julia continued, and maybe what Michael really needs is for us to stop fighting each other and work together to find the best path forward. She looked directly at Richard. If independent experts come and objectively observe Michael's progress, if they see with their own eyes the connection we've established and the methods we've developed together, perhaps we can finally reach a consensus based on what's best for him, not on our own agendas or fears. Edward seemed about to object, but something in Julia's eyes stopped him. Do you really believe that? He asked, searching her eyes for any sign that she was merely resigning herself, giving up the fight. I believe that the truth, when observed honestly, speaks for itself, Julia replied. If what we've built here with Michael is truly what he needs, it will be evident to anyone who looks with truly open eyes. Richard studied Julia with a new respect. Your confidence is admirable. Miss Miller, it's not confidence, she corrected gently. It's faith in people's ability to see beyond appearances when they genuinely care about a child's well-being. The moment was interrupted by the sound of Michael clapping his hands, delighted with a tower of blocks he had managed to build on his own. The three adults turned to watch him, momentarily united by the pure joy of that small triumph. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next Wednesday, Richard informed them, his voice now devoid of its initial hostility. Until then, I suggest we keep Michael's routine as normal as possible. And what about the press? Edward asked. The stories keep multiplying. My office is already working on that, Richard replied. We've obtained injunctions against the most aggressive publications. As for the rest, Perhaps it's time to control the narrative instead of simply reacting to it. Julia and Edward exchanged questioning glances. What are you suggesting exactly? Edward asked. An exclusive interview, Richard proposed. Not with sensationalist tabloids, but with a reputable publication. A chance to present your side of the story, to show who Julia really is and the extraordinary work she's been doing with Michael. The suggestion took them both by surprise, especially coming from Richard, who until recently had seemed so critical of the whole arrangement. Why the change of heart? Edward asked, still cautious. Richard looked at Michael, who was now approaching Julia, seeking her approval for his block tower. Because I'm beginning to realize that I may have judged too hastily, he admitted, and because, regardless of our differences, we all want what's best for Michael. Maybe it's time to try a different path. In the days that followed, a strange truce settled over the Blackwood residence. Richard remained as a guest, spending time with Michael and, to everyone's surprise, closely observing Julia's methodology in action. The interview was arranged with a respected business magazine, known for its serious and factual approach. Edward and Julia participated together, telling the true story, how a burst pipe in the middle of the night had led to their unlikely meeting, how Michael had inexplicably connected with Julia when all conventional approaches had failed, how a professional partnership had gradually evolved into something deeper and more genuine. They also spoke openly about Michael's autism diagnosis and how Julia's own neurodivergence had created a bridge of understanding where only walls had existed before. I am not an opportunist looking for an easy life, Julia stated with quiet dignity during the interview. I'm someone who, through circumstances I don't fully understand myself, was able to reach a child when he needed it most. Everything else, my relationship with Edward, the material comfort I now have, are consequences, not goals. Edward, for his part, spoke unreservedly about how Julia had transformed not only Michael's life but his own as well. After I lost Helen, I was in survival mode. Existing but not truly living. Julia taught me how to be a better father to Michael, and in the process, she reminded me what it feels like to be truly alive again. The interview, published days before the court hearing, generated an unexpected wave of support. Parents of neurodivergent children wrote letters sharing their own struggles to find connection and understanding. Child development experts spoke out publicly about how secure emotional bonds are fundamental for children on the spectrum, sometimes more important than formal credentials. Even some of the Blackwood Group's investors issued notes of support, acknowledging that the family values demonstrated by Edward were, in fact, consistent with the company's corporate philosophy, which had always emphasized the importance of the human factor over purely financial metrics. On the eve of the hearing, Richard surprised everyone by requesting a meeting with Edward and Julia in the office. I've spent the last few days reflecting deeply, he began, his tone softer than usual, observing Michael, reading the detailed reports you've kept, speaking with the therapists who work under Julia's guidance. He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. And I've come to the conclusion that I made a mistake based on prejudices I didn't even know I had. Edward and Julia exchanged surprised glances. What are you saying, Richard? Edward asked. I'm saying I'm going to withdraw the court petition, Richard replied directly. There's no need for a hearing, no need for external evaluations. What you've built here, it works. And it works precisely because it comes from the heart, not just from textbooks or framed diplomas. The tension that had permeated the house for days suddenly dissipated, like morning fog under the rising sun. That's unexpected, Edward commented, still processing the turn of events. For me as well, Richard admitted with a self-aware smile. But Helen always said my greatest flaw was my stubbornness, and my greatest virtue was my ability to admit when I was wrong. Once the evidence became indisputable, he turned specifically to Julia. I apologize, Miss Miller. I judged you based on assumptions, not facts. I presumed that your origins and lack of formal education meant you couldn't offer what Michael needs. I was wrong. Julia, she corrected softly. Just Julia, please. Richard nodded, accepting the implicit offer of a new page in their relationship. There's one more thing, he added, taking an envelope from his briefcase. While preparing the documentation to withdraw the petition, I received this. It's a formal proposal from the British Autism Support Association. He handed the envelope to Julia, who opened it curiously. Inside was an official letter, inviting her to document her methodology and participate in a pilot program to train caregivers of children on the spectrum. They were impressed with your interview and with Michael's progress reports, which we made public as part of the preparation for the hearing, Richard explained. They believe your intuitive approach, combined with the structured integration of conventional methods, could represent a significant advancement in the field. Julia felt tears forming, tears of validation, of recognition, not just for her work with Michael, but for her own journey as a neurodivergent person who had found strength in her difference. "This means so much," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "It means you've turned something personal into something that can help countless other children and families," Edward commented, pride evident in his voice. That night, after Michael had fallen asleep and Richard had retired to his room, Edward and Julia found themselves once again on the terrace under the starry London sky. There was a new quality to their shared silence, no longer fraught with unresolved tension, but filled with nascent possibilities. "What happens now?" Julia finally asked, her fingers lightly brushing against Edward's on the railing. "Now," Edward replied, lacing his fingers with hers, "we build something together. Something that isn't defined by what others expect or what society deems appropriate." Julia smiled, feeling the weight of the past few weeks finally lift. "We'll need time," she observed. "For us, for Michael, for the world around us to adjust to this new reality." "We have all the time in the world," Edward answered, bringing her hand to his lips in a gesture of reverence. "And we have something I've discovered is far more valuable than time or money or power." "What's that?" Julia asked, though she already knew the answer. "Authenticity," Edward replied simply. "The courage to be who we truly are, to build a life based on genuine connections, not imposed expectations." In Michael's room, where a monitoring system silently transmitted images to the tablet resting on the terrace, the boy slept serenely, clutching the small pillow Julia had brought from her old flat in Barking, a transitional object that carried the comforting scent of the person who, in every way that truly mattered, had become his mother. 2 weeks later, Nora was discharged from the hospital, her condition substantially improved, thanks to the experimental treatment that was now showing promising results. As promised, she moved into the apartment in the annex, bringing with her a warm grandmotherly presence that completed the forming family circle. Michael, who had initially observed the newcomer with the caution typical of children on the spectrum facing change, soon developed a special affection for Nora, who seemed to have a natural talent for connecting with him on his own terms. "He reminds me of you as a child," she commented to Julia one afternoon, watching as Michael meticulously lined up his toys in precise patterns, so attentive to detail, so sensitive to everything around him. "I think that's why we understand each other so well," Julia replied, watching the boy with uncontained love. "We speak the same silent language." The British Autism Support Association began documenting Julia's methodology, and she now dedicated part of her time to working with other families of neurodivergent children. What had started as an individual connection with Michael was gradually transforming into something larger, an approach that valued intuition and empathy as much as established protocols. Edward, for his part, surprised the corporate world by announcing a new division of the Blackwood Group focused on assistive technologies for people with special needs. It was his way of turning personal experience into a positive force for others facing similar challenges. And Richard, who had initially been the biggest skeptic, became one of the staunchest advocates for the new family that was forming. His law firm began offering pro bono services to families of children with autism who were fighting for access to proper treatment and educational inclusion. "Helen would be proud," he commented during a Sunday dinner, watching how Michael now interacted comfortably, seated between Edward and Julia, not just of Michael's progress, but of how we've all grown through this journey. 6 months after the fateful night of the burst pipe, in an intimate ceremony held in the residence's garden, Edward and Julia formalized their union. Michael, wearing a small suit that matched his father's, carried the rings with surprising focus and evident joy. Nora, now considerably stronger and healthier, couldn't hold back her tears as she watched her daughter, the girl who had always put everyone else first, finally receive the love she so richly deserved. The celebrant, sensitive to Michael's sensory profile, conducted a brief and meaningful ceremony, highlighting how sometimes the deepest connections arise from the most unexpected circumstances. What began with a broken pipe, he observed, transformed into a bridge between worlds that seemed irreconcilably separate. After the vows, when it was time for the first kiss as a married couple, Michael surprised everyone by declaring with unusual clarity, "Family?" It was just one word, but it carried the meaning of an entire journey. From a child isolated in his own world to a boy capable of recognizing and celebrating the bonds that surrounded him. From an invisible cleaner working in the shadows of the night to a woman fully visible and valued precisely for who she was, not in spite of it. In the end, it wasn't Edward's financial empire, nor Julia's innovative therapeutic approach, nor even Richard's legal and emotional support that made the real difference. It was the ability of an autistic child to see beyond social conventions and recognize authentic love when no one else could. Michael, whom some had once considered a lost cause, turned out to be the wisest of them all, the first to realize that sometimes hearts recognize each other in a language that transcends words, titles, and social expectations. And as night fell on the Blackwood residence, now truly a home in the deepest sense of the word, the new family gathered to gaze at the stars, each silently thanking the series of improbable chances, a burst pipe, a late cleaner, a shared glance in the dimness of a child's room that had transformed separate lives into an indissoluble whole. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Julia and Edward has deeply touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore unlikely connections and the transformative power of true love. Find it here by clicking the link on the left of your screen.